tell us why is your area known as Lowcountry?
Yeah, so the Lowcountry is sort of a designation that's been given to us. It encompasses the southeastern part of South Carolina. It's located below the fall line of South Carolina. And depending on who you ask, it can range between 4 and 12 counties. Beaufort, Colleton, Hampton, Jasper, they're always considered in the Lowcountry. You would be hard pressed not to name Charleston in there as well. But basically, it's a vast area, and the reason why it's called the Lowcountry is it's located at sea level or somewhere less than 300 feet. So everything here is relatively low, really close to sea level. And with the tides that we have here, there's a lot of interaction with this this coastal area. Half of the East Coast marshlands in the United States are in the state of South Carolina. Half of that are in Beaufort County. So it's a very vast and expansive place to fish out of. If you look at the coast of the United States, from the Miami area all the way up to St. Augustine and Jacksonville, you've got those white sandy beaches. And then once you hit that area, you start to get into some of those marshes. And then once you get up to, say, Wilmington, North Carolina, or the Outer Banks, you start getting into more of a mix of marsh and beach areas. So you can kind of see that it is sort of condensed here in this one small area. We're located in the South Atlantic Bight, which basically means that's where the United States kind of dips in right here at South Carolina. And basically that acts as a funnel for, really everything else that's going on. So things that happen both to the north and the south of us really sort of happen to a greater extent, here in the Lowcountry. Maybe a little less so with big storms that we have on the East Coast, named storms, but things like tides and currents are really sort of compounded in this area. Also, another claim to fame that we have in this area is the Ace Basin, which is almost 250,000 acres of just protected habitat. And so when you think about that from a fishing perspective, or just from an observation standpoint, and compare that to the number of people that we have living in our city, Beaufort, the city of Beaufort, has less than 20,000 people in it. Of course, the metro would expand on that. Kind of compare that with the Charleston area, the Savannah area. Each one of those cities has at least 150,000 people. But with the metro area, you're talking almost 1 million people. So it's a very, very expansive resource. And the user group compared to other places is relatively small. So I almost don't even consider myself as, a fishing guide per se. I consider myself almost a liaison between having this incredible resource in my backyard and sort of bridging that gap for the angler and bringing them to where they need to be to sort of experience this area.
I want to go back to the very first thing that you said was it's below the fall line. Can you touch on that just a second? Tell me what that is.
It's almost like an imaginary line on the surface that runs through South Carolina. It's where the Piedmont area meets the coastal region. Basically, when you cross that line, you're getting into some mixed environments. So as opposed to being, a little more freshwater oriented north of the fall line. Once we get into the south east, we get into a little more sandy soils, a little more coastal environments, a lot of wetlands, and then of course the saltwater influence that we have here.
I don't think I caught that at first, so I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Let's go into the show introduction. From high atop the world headquarters of Southeastern Fly, this is the Southeastern Fly podcast. Feel free to share the podcast with your friends and your fishing partners. Smash that subscribe button so that you'll be the first to know when an episode drops. And if you find value in this podcast and want to give back, drop by the Southeastern Fly store and simply make a purchase. Who is our guest today on Southeastern Fly? He is a longtime inshore captain. He fishes the waters in and around Beaufort, South Carolina. He and I served on the Fly Fishing International Virtual Expo panel together. He gave some really good information, which I decided I wanted to follow up on. That information that he gave is the type of information that we all look for here on Southeastern Fly. He books trips out of Bay Street Outfitters in historic Beaufort, South Carolina. Please welcome Captain Tony Welch. Tony, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
As I said in that introduction, you had given really good information. There were 4 of us, I think. I really kind of attached to 2 things in that. One of the guys, it was all virtual. One of the guys was drinking wine. And I kind of was like, wow, that is a good idea.
Yep.
that he was in the audience. He wasn't on the panel.
That's right.
And then since I had been over around the Hilton Head area and Charleston and Savannah and that area, whenever you started talking, I was like, wow, I can really relate to that. And then you and I talked the other night. We were talking about fishing the creeks and canals and backwaters, which interested even me even more. I believe it'll be interesting to other folks that listen to this podcast, because even though it's saltwater and even though you're fishing for redfish, it sounded very similar to trout fishing on a river or a creek or something like that, to where you could run a small boat. So I think that a lot of the folks in our audience will be able to relate to the creeks and the canals and the backwaters and that sort of thing. Can you explain some of the advantages of fishing those canals and creeks and backwaters around Beaufort in that area, and the nuances of fishing that type of water?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, you touched on a lot of really good things there. A lot of times when we think about saltwater fishing, to me, the main thing that pops into my mind would be fishing flats, these big, wide open expanses, which obviously we have that here. The next thing that comes to my mind would be, maybe surf casting or casting jetties for things like stripers. And then you move on to things like fishing mangroves down in the Everglades, which I love to do. But one thing you don't really think a lot about are fishing these smaller creeks. And we've got a large amount of creeks here in the area, and it's one of my favorite things to do, both personally and as a guide. One reason why I like it so much as a guide is because it's sort of a familiar environment for my anglers, especially my trout anglers. They come here to the Lowcountry, never have experienced salt water. And so it really sort of suits their eye, I guess is what you would say. They've been in an environment very similar. Obviously, when you think about creeks and trout, you're thinking about a little more running water than what we're going to be experiencing in these creeks. I don't want to discount how much running water there can be in those creeks, but it won't be running while we're in there. But it's a great place to bring somebody that's sort of used to that environment. But it also does a number of things for us. If it's a little bit breezy out, those wide open flats are the first thing to get muddied up, to get choppy and get very hard to see into the water and find those fish pushing. So it's those creeks, because of the tidal influence, have very steep banks. So we can get back in there and we can duck that wind. And then we can use those steep banks as well with the tall grasses on the side to sort of cut any glare that we would have in the water. Now, those creeks usually don't flow in a linear fashion. They're usually some sort of bend going through there, some sort of a obstruction. So you're not going to have perfect visibility the entire push of that creek, but you are going to have a lot of really good opportunities to find and see fish pushing around.
And one of the things that I find whenever I'm out in salt water, like if we were on a mud flat, let's just take that mud flat that you brought up. I don't think my vision is as good as it used to be. So when a guide says, hey, there's a fish laying there at 10 o'clock, it takes me a minute to get that 10 o'clock and see that fish until I get 3 or 4 or 5 fish in, and then I'm like, okay, I know exactly what I'm looking for, and that helps me a little bit. But I can see fish in those creeks. It might be, hey, cast over toward that root on that tree, or that funny looking blade of grass, or whatever's out there. It gives a target to us trout anglers that fish trout. We get to fish trout a whole lot more than we get to fish out in the salt. So I think that you could say, hey, there's a target. Here's your target. Here's what you're looking for. Just drop it there. And it feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like that might be a little easier on me.
Absolutely, because when you're on those big flats, you've got the whole clock face. We call out positions from, I've had shots at 7 o'clock all the way back around the clock to around 4 o'clock, and so these fish can pop up anywhere. When you get back in those creeks, not only do you narrow that clock face because you're narrowing the body of water you're in, but you're giving yourself more opportunity to have landmarks that you can cast to. Just like you were saying, maybe there's a blade of grass. Maybe there's, a big kind of indention where some fiddler crabs have been, or a big ball of fiddler crabs up on the water line. One of the main things that I'm looking for when I'm scouting these creeks is oyster mounds. And so you can sort of pick out, different oyster mounds and say, okay, it's on the, I see a fish on the third oyster mound and it's on the point coming off of that. So you can get very specific on how you call those shots out. And also, because those oyster mounds are there, what they're doing is they're holding a lot of really small bait that attracts even bigger bait, which attracts bigger redfish. So redfish in creeks tend to get in a loop, and that's to say that they will sort of get a pattern that they like. Now, it's at a very particular stage of the tide, and it will change as that tide fluctuates, but you can almost watch what that fish does one time and then kind of get a game plan together to get your shot on that fish. It doesn't always happen like that, but it seems like in creeks it happens like that more often than you would see on flats.
So let's talk about that just a second here, because I want to make sure that I'm clear on it. And I kind of hijacked this question. I went to the Facebook group and asked some questions, but I kind of hijacked this a little bit because it's interesting to me. But you're talking about a pattern where do they come off of that oyster bed, let's say, and kind of make a big circle then? Or are you talking about the next time you come in with the water level the same?
Actually, I'm talking about both. So if there's a creek that I like, and I'm fishing it, usually I can figure out what those fish are doing in that creek and come back. You don't want to come back day after day, but you can sort of make it one of your stops, to hit every now and then. But also inside of that, the first time you're pushing a creek, and let's say you see a fish, kind of cruise down a bank, and then he slides off into a little bit deeper water where you can no longer see him. In my opinion, it's best to stop what you're doing right there and see if that fish does that exact same thing again. A lot of times they'll just swim right back up the creek and make that same loop down the bank again.
Do you think the same fish hold in the same creeks for weeks on end, or is it just fish cycling that creek?
I would go out on a further limb and say that they will spend their entire juvenile life in the same creek. A lot of fish will do that. South Carolina DNR stocks redfish. I know a lot of people that do not call in those tags on a juvenile redfish because they know that they're going to be from the exact place that they released them from. Our fish here just don't move, which is one good reason to practice catch and release. Because if you want to have a great opportunity the next day, I mean, the best thing you can do is let your fish go today.
Yeah, right.
But these fish will live in the same creeks now. There is a lot of seasonal variation there. In the summertime, maybe that creek gets way too hot for them, so they pull off into a little deeper water. But probably the next fall or winter, you'll be able to find that same group of fish holding in that creek.
And how many years do you think they live there?
So our redfish probably stay inshore anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So I think on average, our fish grow anywhere from 7 to 10 inches every single year. Once a male fish gets to be 29 inches and a female gets to be 33 inches, I believe they're considered mature at that point, and they will have a tendency to start migrating offshore. Once they go offshore with the other adult fish, when they come back inshore, it's almost like they forgot how to feed in inshore waters and really stick with the other bigger fish and stay in really deep water. So catching a 40-inch fish in the Lowcountry is kind of a unicorn fish. It does happen on the fly, but it's something it's a little bit more difficult to do.
Are they running up north and coming back down? And so what I'm getting at is around the Outer Banks, and those guys out there, those folks out there are fishing off the beach with their big long 12-foot surf rods and that sort of thing, and catching those big, they call them red drum. Would that be possibly the same fish, or am I off base there?
It would probably not be the exact same fish, as far as I don't think at least many of our redfish would migrate up that far. It's more of a, kind of migrate out and then come back in. So find that structure offshore and then come back in. Usually we see those bigger fish come back in late summer, early fall.
Okay, that makes total sense now. Right along the same lines, the tidal creeks. So we spent some time in Hilton Head, and this was 30 years ago, probably. And at that time, you could actually feed the dolphins. I don't know if you were around then or not, but you could go to Walmart and buy ballyhoo frozen, let it thaw out, and go feed the dolphins if you could get out there. So we went out on a dolphin feeding cruise. When we got there into Hilton Head, we got there on Friday night, and everybody picked what they wanted to do. And I was looking through one of those brochure things, they have do this, and here's a $30 off coupon, and blah, 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 all that
Right.
stuff. I was looking through one of them, and everybody was picking what they want to do, like, oh, I want to go ride the bumper boats, and I want to go play golf at this golf course, and I want to do this. And they said, David, what do you want to do? And I said, and I just had went to one of those pages where it was an old, like a pirate ship, and there was a lady with her hand out, and there was a dolphin. She had a little ballyhoo in her hand, and there was a dolphin there, and she was feeding that dolphin. That dolphin was up out of the water coming in. I said, I want to do that right there. So we went out and did that. And when it came time to feed the dolphins, I was like, hey, I'm ready to, I'm ready to feed the dolphin. And she said, oh, no, you can't feed the dolphin. She said, only I can feed the dolphin. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. This is $30 a piece. This is my one shot to get out and feed the dolphins, and you just blew it. So as we were coming back in, my wife was with me, and her sister was with us, and my brother and sister-in-law. And there was a little boat there, and these people were feeding the dolphins off this little, looked like it's about 18-foot boat. On the side, it said, rent me.
Yep.
It had a telephone number and all that. So my wife said, I want to do that. Now, if there's anything to do with animals or mammals or anything like that, especially dolphin, my wife is all in. She wrote down the telephone number. So we went back to the condo and sitting out on the balcony, and here comes this little rent me boat. That's what we started calling it, was the rent me boat. And they came into the marina that we were staying in on the back side of the island. And now there's a big bridge there.
Okay.
That kind of cuts the island kind of in half, I guess.
Yeah.
It wasn't there at this time. Anyway, she said, go down there and see what it costs, and it was like 4 hours was whatever. I don't remember. $200. We didn't have, $200 to our name, but we scraped up enough money to do that. And we asked the guy, hey, how do you feed the dolphins? You can run up to Walmart and get some ballyhoo. So we did that, and we go out, and I was like, I want to go up the creek. So we, instead of going left toward the bay,
right,
we went right. And they didn't say right on red returning, none of those little hints that would have been very helpful. So we go up through there, and there's a boat that went over to Hague Island. Hague Island, I think, is that the name of it?
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. There's a boat that went from kind of our marina, or one up in more shallow water, to Hague Island, and came back all day long. And we passed that, and I was like, hey, it's, we don't need to be up in here with all these big boats. So we turn around and we start coming back out. And when we come back out, we were going around this right-hand turn bend in the shallow part of the bay, and I ran that daggum boat aground.
I can understand that. That's it's a pretty common thing to happen around here.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, I was that guy.
yeah. Well, I think we've all been that guy. I mean, sometimes, I'll go out there and, I don't really run aground, but I'll get intentionally stuck to try to get back into some of these creeks. But what you're describing there. Well, first of all, with the dolphins, I wouldn't do that anymore, because they're more protected now. So
yeah, they were not protected then.
Yeah, DNR discourages any interaction with those guys. So
it was perfectly fine back then, and we we let the fish thaw out and we fed them, but you could tell, just like a trout around here, kind of get that matty mullet, just kind of discolored belly.
Yeah,
some of those dolphins were getting that already, and I don't know how long they had been doing it. We just swerved into this thing, but yeah, we at that time it was okay to do it, but now of course you can't. But obviously we were on fallen water when that was happening, and to my to my credit, I wasn't the only one that ran aground, because we were sitting there in the mud, basically touching the ground, and another rent me boat came in right beside us and ran aground right beside us, with us going, no, don't come in here. So anyway,
and that's something that absolutely happens. Our water here, it's one of the most difficult waters that I've ever navigated in personally, but also, I think with some of the stuff I've done with guides as well. I have so much respect for this area. Just with our tidal fluctuations, nothing ever looks the same. I know you've done some fishing in Louisiana. I looked at some of Louisiana's tides today. I think the biggest one that I saw, and I didn't look long, but it was about 2 feet. But that was 2 feet from high to low, and that lasted over a 12-hour period. We had a very, very soft tide today, and it was about 6.5 feet high to low. and that was over a 6-hour period.
Okay.
So it's a very, very difficult sort of region to navigate. Navigating at dead low tide is probably your best option. It doesn't seem like it would be, but at that point, all the oysters are going to be exposed. So really, I mean, you just take it slow and kind of work your way around the mud. You follow navigational channels as much as possible, but it's one of those things you've got to be extremely careful navigating around here.
And obviously, we were on low tide. We probably could have just hung out for about 3 hours, and that would have been the end of our trip. But we could have hung out and probably got back moving again. But they came and pulled us off. But that was obviously low tide, and you're talking about a huge swing in tide compared to some of the other places I've been. But can you give us some information on fishing low tide?
Yeah, so low tide, generally I like to fish. If I'm going to fish creeks, I'm going to fish those a little closer to low tide. And that goes back to those steep banks that we were talking about. If it's a steep bank and that water's coming in pretty quick, it's not going to be long before those fish have a lot of water to hide in. So there's nothing that's kind of forcing them up and on the edges. And once it gets to the grass, they're pretty hard to see. I like to fish creeks at low water. I also like to fish those big mud flats that we were talking about. Every day when I start off fishing, that's one of the things that I want to show people, because I just have this feeling in the back of my mind that that's what people want to see, are these big saltwater flats. They want to see these wide open spaces where hopefully they can see a fish. And weather dependent, I definitely want to show that to them. Those flats can be frustrating, especially to the new saltwater angler. You'll find a lot of times that, there are a lot of mullet up there that are they can be sort of distracting, jumping around and pushing water.
Yes.
And then, a lot of times we get hung up as anglers, trying to see the fish. And a lot of times you're not going to do that. You're looking for the pushes, the signs that fish is there. There are countless times where I see fish tail or fish with his back totally out of the water, so much so that his eyeballs are out of the water. And you'll see that some, but I'm far more effective by looking for these pushes, either singles or doubles, or, as we get on into the wintertime, 500 to 1,000 fish all in a school. Those schools are a little bit easier to see, but it's also very deceiving on where those fish are in that school, because as that school moves, you've got an area about 10 feet ahead of that push where those fish are moving, and they just haven't, they're causing the wake behind them. It's much like a boat. That wake is where that boat has been, but it's not where that boat is currently. So it's one of those things that I love to do, and, try to do it every chance that I get. If we have a little wind, we can use that shoreline, fish in the lee side of the wind, have great shots doing that. So we move around as much as we can to create those situations.
So if I'm tying flies for low tide, are you using like jig hooks, that type 60, 45 degree angles hooks, or are you using just regular old saltwater hooks?
So I've started using a lot more jig hooks here in the past, I would say 2 years. I've been doing a lot of different stuff with fly tying here recently, especially for my summertime stuff. What I like to tell people, especially people that don't get to do this often, is, I can tell you my favorite redfish fly, and that's the one that's in front of a redfish. I tell a lot of people that color doesn't matter, size doesn't matter, what that fly is, made out of, that doesn't matter until it does. So, really, I kind of start off the day with a few truths. If it's bright outside, I like a lighter pattern, more natural pattern. And if it's cloudy or cloudy water, then I start with, my blacks or my black and purples. You'll find situations. There was a situation all summer long. Well, not all summer, but for about 10 days where we had bright, sunny days, and I couldn't get anything to eat anything but a black and purple. So there are some, kind of exceptions to the rule, but, I start off, most of the days, kind of with that in mind. But as far as tying goes, I love to use pretty heavy flies. So like a medium, lead dumbbell eye. I always put a weed guard on it. Everybody, has their own opinion on weed guards. You talk to people and they say, well, if it's protecting the hook, then it's protecting it from a fish as well. But, really the way a redfish is designed with those crushers, And the weed guard that I use is a 30-pound Mason's hard mono. It's a single strand, and that to me is enough to, either fish some low tide mud flats where we have that, sort of red grass on the bottom, to try to not get hung up there, or even in the shorter Spartina grass. It'll protect the hook point there so you don't get fouled up. It's weed resistant. It's definitely not weed proof. So you're still going to get hung up. But if you try to bring a bare hook, with no weed guard through this environment, it's going to be very frustrating because there's just so much to get caught up on. And then outside of that, usually I have three things that I want my fly to have. I want it to have some sort of flash, and that's to grab the attention. And I'll come back and talk about that in just a second. I want some sort of synthetic, something like an EP brush, to build up a profile. I want that fish to be able to see that fly from above it, from below it, from behind it, from the side, all different angles. I want a redfish to be able to see that fly. And so that synthetic really helps that. It also helps with pushing water, but I'm not quite as worried about pushing water as you would be maybe on some trout streams or maybe in the Florida Everglades. Also, I want some natural fibers in there as well. Those natural fibers, say some marabou or a zonker strip, when you give that fly a strip and that natural fiber sort of shrinks down, it's always going to rebound. So it's almost like that fly is giving you some movement even when you're not stripping it. Back to the flash, don't use any flash in the wintertime. When we've got those fish schooled up, and then there's really large schools, I want to give those fish as few negative cues as possible. I am trying to essentially hide that fly from those redfish, because what I do at the vise, Mother Nature does a way better job than I do. So I'm not going to hide it better than Mother Nature does. If I've got 500 fish, I've got 1,000 eyeballs that are there to pick something apart. So I'm just trying to be as natural, the least amount of intrusion that I can.
I've heard that groups of fish many times. If it's really cold, no fish, no flash, no flash, not no fish. Really cold, no flash. So I've heard that a lot of times, and there's a lot of folks out there, a lot of guides out there that live and die by that. So you're not the first one to have said that. So it really does make sense. Yeah, and especially in this area, during the summertime, a lot of people think we have dirty water. It's just got a lot of algae. That warm water allows that algae to bloom. So these fish are used to feeding in dark water. Now you go to, this time of year, really kind of November 15th to, late March, early April, and that algae can't bloom. So we've got, essentially gin clear water. So you take a fish that's used to feeding on something small in dark water, and then you got to throw something even smaller than that in the clear water. So I fish anywhere from size 2 to 2/0 in the summertime, and really in the wintertime drop down to size 4, and that's the largest I usually go. The low tide, is there any chance for a wading angler to get in and wade around there at all on low tide? That seems to me like that might be possibly the best time. I don't know. It is one of the best times to fish. The problem here is the environment and that tidal movement. So with that tidal movement, you have got a tremendous amount of nutrients that are being pushed in and out of this area. A lot of that comes from dead and decaying Spartina grass. Nothing's wrong with the grass. It's just part of the process. But with that push of water and all those nutrients in the environment, you've got a lot of, what we call pluff mud, which is essentially almost like quicksand. And that's scary in and of itself. And then you throw into the mix that there could be some oyster shells underneath. I've heard some pretty bad horror stories of people falling into some pretty bad situations trying to get through low tide by wading. So if you're going to wade during low tide, I would stick to, trying to stay around, some white shell. Usually white shell is going to be a little more of a firm bottom, or you could try to walk through the marshes and get to a creek and maybe have access that way. But it's going to be a pretty tough kind of way to go, because there's areas where, the marsh grass will end, and then the water line will be,
50 yards away at low tide. So you've got a lot of environment that you've got to get through just to get to the water line. So it's a pretty tough thing to do for the wade fishermen.
Well, let's flip the script here just a little bit then, and let's talk about the flood tide. So I've also been on the water during the flood tide. And of course, the Lowcountry is known for the flood tide, but we won't always hit that flood tide either. I mean, and I'm talking about probably the vacationing. Let's take the vacationing angler. Let's say that they don't always hit the flood tide. But if somebody's planning a trip, they can forecast that out a little better probably than than Mama wants to go to Hilton Head for a week in the summer. But if we're lucky and it all comes together, can you give us some information on fishing that flood tide?
We can forecast these flood tides out, really far in advance. So if you're looking to plan your, let's say, summer 2024 vacation, we can with some accuracy, sort of predict these flood tides. Right now, for summer 2023, it's very easy. We have our tide logs all already out, so we can look at those tides and see what's going to be a good tide. And so when I'm looking for a flood tide to fish in the Lowcountry, I kind of start at the resource that everybody has, and that's a tide log. And you can pick them up, you can get them online, you can get them, at any good shop. It gives you a list of high and low tides in the area over the entire year. And so I get the Southeast tide log, and I will look at the Savannah River entrance. Now, the reason why I use the Savannah River entrance, it gives you two options, Savannah River or Charleston. I use the Savannah River just because back in the day when I was doing this without an app, it was easier math. So that's the only reason why I do that. But if you look at Savannah River and it's a 7.3 there, you're going to be pretty close to having a good flood tide. Anything more than that in that shorter Spartina grass is going to flood. And that's really what we're looking for. There's a lot of Spartina grass in the area, a lot of long grasses in the area, but that shorter Spartina grass is going to be the environment where these fish tail and that we're able to get to them with a fly rod. The reason why it's shorter grass is because it doesn't flood all the time. We get 2 high tides a day, but maybe, we get 10 flood tides a month, maybe not even that. And some of those flood tides, they'll be in the dark, so you won't even be able to get to fish those. So what we got to have a saying in the Lowcountry, if it's the knee or below, you're good to go. So that means that shorter Spartina grass is when it's below your knee, it's usually going to be a firmer bottom. And so that is an opportunity for an angler who wants to wade and pursue fish with a fly rod in South Carolina. They can do that without having step foot in a boat. And basically what happens is, these redfish, a redfish is going to tail anywhere from Mexico to Massachusetts. These fish, that's just what they do. They have an inferior mouth or a subterminal mouth, which basically means they have an overbite, which means they are designed to feed on something below their body. And so they know that these fiddler crabs are making their burrows in this short grass. And the reason why they're making their burrows in the short grass is because they don't want to get flooded out either. And so these fish, and I don't think it's every redfish is really keyed in on this, but some are, they know that those crabs are up there and they will go up there and root around to find that next meal. So obviously most of our fly patterns are going to be sort of, I don't even want to say crab imitation. They're going to be, crab suggestions. So you don't have to get too technical with the fly selection here. Really, I try to use something size 2, and I try to use something with a copper color. Also, something that I do is I try to include a little bit of purple in the fly as well. We have a lot of our fiddler crabs will have this purple stamp on the back. So it's a color that I think these fish have just learned to want to go after when they're up there on the flats. But it's a really cool visual game because these fish will go to feed on these crabs, and when they do, it's below their body, and so when they tip up, that tail sticks completely out of the water. So we go from the low tide of being very selective on what we're seeing and what we're pursuing to being on the flood tide, and everybody in the boat can see this fish. You know, there is some skill involved. The more fish you see tail, the better you get at it. But when you've got, especially me on the back and two anglers down low, it gives you great angles to see these fish different ways. So it can become pretty effective in that regard. But even just wading out in their environment, you're on their level. So, I mean, if you kind of think about it, as you get higher, say on a polling platform, and you've got a triangle on the water, that profile gets smaller and smaller the higher and higher you get. So I'm not going to say you're at an advantage by being in the water and waiting for these fish, but you got to be an optimist with it. And so you've got a lot of things playing into your favor, and you can do so in a little bit kind of safer, in a little bit safer environment than waiting around at low tide.
Just seeing, I love tailing fish too. I mean, who doesn't? You know, which way are they pointed?
Yep.
You know, it's tailing. All right, which way is he pointing? I can't tell. And always pointed right. Just cast right, just 6 inches to his tail, and you'll knock him right in the head. And just, man, there's something about that is super exciting. I can see 3 people in a boat, you up on top, 2 people down, and this excitement just continues to build and build and build. And then you make that cast, and when everything goes right, it's so much fun, you know. And then if it doesn't, you get you know, but
yeah. and then everybody gets to see that, you know, and it's good natured ribbing. But you know what you said there is when everything goes right, and that's one of the most, you know, kind of frustrating things about flood tide fishing is, you know, things have to go your way because you are in some grass. These fish are very intent on what they're doing, so you've got, I mean, there's a great deal of skill involved, no doubt. But there's also, you've got to be in situations that sort of work into your favor. I've casted to countless redfish that, you know, you get in front of them and you make that perfect cast, and then all of a sudden they start wagging the other way. You try to make a good cast on them, and then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you can't see that fish anymore, and it's just like he's vanished up there on the flat, and you have no idea what happened. So it's definitely one of the coolest things, you know, and it's one of the things that made me want to do this full time after seeing that the first time. It's, you know, it's sort of one of those things that gets in your blood, and it's just absolutely amazing. And the fact that we can predict it with some sort of regularity, and I use predict, you know, sort of in finger quotes there, because you know, it's like some days you'll get up there and everything is absolutely perfect, and you know, for whatever reason you see one tail, and it's just the most frustrating thing to have happen to you. But the flip side of that is you can have days that just seem absolutely terrible. The wind's blowing 20 miles an hour. I've had white caps on the flats on the flood, and still done pretty well. So it's you know, it's just one of those things that you got to pursue and stay after, and you know, you'll definitely be rewarded in the end.
There's really something to be said about putting someone on a fish, even if it's a trout that's not feeding on top. Let's just say it's feeding on the bottom, and you could see it, which is similar.
Yep.
Not exact, but it's similar. There's something about that to say, hey, cast right there, do these 3 or 4 things. In the trout world, it's let it float down, you know, and be ready, and then tell them when to set the hook. There's something about that, and that same thing just came through with you. I mean, you could see it's like the excitement's there. I could tell, you know, of cast.
Absolutely.
And all right, be ready, and you know, little strip, little tick, little whatever, and let it sit. Okay, ready, come tight on it. You know, that sort of thing is, I can see where that's super exciting.
Yeah, I think it's the exact same thing in the trout world. Kind of what really drives that excitement for me is, you know, on those low tide fish, and I'm sure for you in the trout world, there are fish that you're going to see that somebody else may not. And when you guys can connect on those fish, you know, that's a lot of fun. But when you've got somebody and they see the fish with you, and you're just, you know, kind of experiencing that together, and then that's when, you know, when buck fever really sets in, and you can actually, you know, kind of experience that with them. It's you know, it's like nothing else. I mean, it's one of the greatest feelings in the world. When
you get a trout guy and he trout sets, how do you keep people from doing that?
So every guide is going to be different. Me, I'm not a yeller. I'm not a screamer. I've had saltwater guides that, you know, sort of got in my head. So my main my main goal is to put people on fish, but another, big goal right alongside that would be not to get in somebody's head.
Right.
What I do is I try to talk about it early. If they say, I fish trout, and I fish, four times a week, and so he says, or she says, I'm gonna trout set, and I'm gonna say, here's what we're gonna do. What I want you to do is when you're stripping this fly in, I want you to listen to me, and I'm going to tell you to get that rod tip low. That doesn't mean that your rod tip is too high unless I tell you it's too high. But I want you to get that rod tip low. And I'm going to tell you to keep that rod tip low the entire time. So much so that I might not even tell you how to strip. I want you to listen to my voice, and you'll know how to strip by me telling you to keep your rod tip low. And so that almost takes them out of the moment because they're thinking about, I'm not taking them away from their fishing, but I'm taking them away from being worried about trout setting. And so if they do trout set, it's no big deal. We're gonna move on. We're gonna find some other people or some other fish. But if you keep that rod tip low and you keep stripping, you're gonna come tight to a redfish. It's not tarpon where you have to keep that rod tip low and then you have to make sure that hook finds its home.
Right.
The hook and your stripping kind of does the work for you, especially on an aggressive fish. But really, any redfish, it's going to be fine to not stick quite as hard as you think you need to.
I have listened to the guide and closed my eyes, just to be honest, and just keep the rod tip low and keep on stripping. And you feel it, and your eyes are closed, and it's not for some reason for me, probably not for everybody. I'm probably the exception, not the rule. But rod tip low, strip, and you'll feel it. And you just keep stripping and keep pulling, and eventually you're going to grab that line and set. But not like a trout set. It will be a strip set. But that's maybe I'm the exception, not the rule.
And what you said there, the cadence you were talking about strip, that to me that sounds like a fast strip. And on fast strips, you're almost always going to hook that fish before you react to the trout set. So a lot of times we get away with a trout set just by stripping it a little bit faster. And really, kind of what you want to do, from my perspective, is wait maybe a little bit longer than you should, and almost feel like you're trying to catch up with that fish if you just can't get away from the trout set. Yeah. I mean, that's another good thing to do.
Yeah, it takes a minute to get away from it. I think the big thing here is not letting it get in your head, like you said. Don't let the guide get in your head. Just, listen to them, do what you can do. And if you trout set, oh, well, you trout set. If you missed a fish, oh, well, let's go find another one. If you got it, all right, you got away with one there. But don't let it get to you. And I've seen people, trout set and just the guide get all crazy and it's, nuclear fusion didn't happen this time, and it just, nobody dies on the table. We're not, it's not a nuclear reactor that's going to go off. We missed a fish. So
that's right. And so, what I like to tell a lot of people, if they trout set and they know it, they beat themselves up. And I tell them, the only thing more ridiculous than trout setting a redfish is when I go out to Colorado and I'm fishing for trout and I have a real nice trout that it eats a dry fly and I try to strip set him and totally miss. So I get some real ugly looks when that happens too. And I think that's a lot more ridiculous. So
yeah, I think
you gotta keep everything pretty lighthearted.
Yeah, you got to keep it in perspective. It's not rocket surgery or whatever they say.
That's right.
Although sometimes it feels like it during the minute, but generally, if you just crack a joke on it and move on, people get it, and everything's fine. So.
Absolutely.
So I think that leads us to that one last question. And we asked this question of everybody. And the reason why I asked this question is I don't want to miss anything that's important. Like we've got some questions and we've bounced some things off of each other. But a lot of times you'll think, all right, I got this one dialed in. And then you talk to somebody later and they go, hey, I wish you would have asked this question. So I kind of turn that back on the folks that we're talking to and ask them, what is the one thing we haven't asked about fly fishing in the low country that we should have asked?
The thing about the low country, this environment, it's going to be a little bit different than some of the other environments that you face, whether that's trout fishing or fishing for tarpon somewhere or permit somewhere else. What I always like to tell people is we've read, a lot of literature, especially I did, sort of getting into this, probably, I guess it's been 25 years now. And really everything was books back then.
Right.
We didn't really have YouTube to learn things. So everything that I was reading kind of early on, was that focus on your accuracy when you're casting first, and then worry about everything else second. But really, as a saltwater fisherman and as a guide, kind of what I would like to see would be somebody focus on distance first. And you say, well, what is distance? I'd say, well, cast the whole fly line. Okay, I can't cast the whole fly line. I don't know if you can, but
No.
it's not something. I mean, maybe I could with a big tailwind, but and
Exactly.
so since we realize that we both can't do that, so what's distance? Well, sometimes it might be somebody going from 20 feet to 25 feet or maybe 30 feet. And so really what that does is it opens up more opportunities. And then, once we talk about distance side of things, I still don't think that it's time to talk about accuracy. And I'm just speaking from my perspective in the low country. I think next, probably the most important thing is the quickness of your delivery. I like a fly to be presented to a fish as quickly as possible. These fish are always on the move. So once it's time to go, it's time to go. And that means being alert at all times. There are times where, I'll tell people, you got a fish that just popped up. He's 20 feet and he's 9 o'clock, and if you hesitate, that fish is not going to be caught. So quickness of delivery, it comes with being aware, but it also comes with practice and not carrying too much line, not having too many false casts. You want to kind of shoot it, out there as quickly as possible. But then after we talk about that, I still don't think accuracy is as important as a quiet body while you're casting. I've got a lot of folks that are great casters, and I tell them, do what you're doing, just do it inside of a telephone booth. Now, it always happens that I'll get some 13-year-old kid that'll turn around and look at me and say, what's a telephone booth? And I'm like, oh, well, I guess.
Got a whole other situation going on there.
That's right. But, what I'm telling you there is, these fish can kind of feel everything that's going on. And so at least when I am giving casting instruction, a lot of times I'll have the person that's learning to fly cast if they're right-handed, put their left foot forward. That way they can look back at their back cast, take a peek back there. But I don't know if you grew up playing sports or not, but putting your left foot in front is a very athletic position.
Right.
And when you stick somebody in a very athletic position, they're going to want to move. And as they move on the boat, those pressure waves are going to go out and they're going to impact the fishing. If we're in the back of a creek, they're going to hit the creek walls and come back on us. If we're on a big flat and we've got a lot of fish working, those fish will be able to feel it. So a lot of times we have plenty of distance. We just won't be able to get, close enough to those fish because we're just a little too rocky on the boat. Now I do everything I can to mitigate that. Either by pushing us up on a shallow area where the bottom of the boat will touch the bottom,
right?
Or I will stick the push pole in the ground and rock opposite of what the angler up front is doing. But if you can, sort of quiet your feet and sort of calm those big muscle groups down, something like that is going to catch you more fish. But, after we talk about that point, then I think it's time to talk about accuracy and probably, one of the funniest things that I tell people is to not be accurate. I don't want you to be accurate in the traditional sense. So if you're coming to fish in the low country, whether with a guide or on your own for tailing fish in the grass, you should practice with your targets having some sort of movement. So let's say you put the pie tin out there that everybody wants to cast to. Well, never cast to that pie tin. Always say, well, that pie tin is moving right to left, and let me cast 2 feet in front of where that pie tin is going. a great drill for that would be to get a water bottle, throw the water bottle out there, and whatever the way the top of the water bottle is pointing, then you lead that water bottle by 2 feet. You'll learn a lot by doing small drills like that. I mean, really, it's the same thing in trout fishing, in that, you know, I'm asking you to lead fish. With trout, you're leading all the trout that you can. I mean, for the most part, I guess we could come up with some outliers, but the difference is in trout fishing, you know, a lot of times you're saying, okay, cast to the top of that seam right there. You know where the fish is going to be.
Yeah.
So you're leading that fish. Your target is just different than what your fish is. So it's a hard concept for people to grasp. But once you can do that, you're going to improve numbers, and you're going to have a lot more fun fishing in saltwater.
Yeah, saltwater is a movement game. I want to go back to, you had made a comment somewhere toward the beginning of that, of getting the fly in front of the fish quickly. That's what it was. Yeah, you were talking about speed. I'm going to go a little different direction with that. And I'm going to have to start tying up some saltwater stuff here in another couple of weeks. Would you say that you want the fly to get down quick? And what I mean by that is a little bit larger dumbbell eyes to get down a little faster. Is there ever a time that you do that?
Everything's all relative. So, you know, when you're coming from the trout world, you've got things, you're probably fishing a lot of times in water deeper than I am. I catch most of my fish in less than 18 inches of water.
Yeah, we are.
So, yeah. And also another, you know, sort of big element in getting a fly down would be the current in the water.
Right.
You're going to have to fight some of that current with weight. And then depending on how you're stripping, you're going to kind of have to overcome maybe some of that swing that you would get as well in the drift, and stripping that back with that weight as well. So I would say that our flies are they're pretty similarly weighted. I am wanting that fly to get down really quick. And I think that I'm probably, you know, kind of in the majority there, that I don't use a whole lot of B chain. Matter of fact, I can't stand B chain eyes for what I do.
Yeah.
My primary gripe with B chain is that they are hollow in the center. And so you're going to get saltwater in it. Once you get saltwater in that B chain, that fly's done.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't think they get the fly down as quickly as they need to. So that medium dumbbell eye, for the most part, is probably pretty good. Once you start getting into some of the extra large, you're getting into some very specific kind of patterns. I do have some stuff like that, especially bigger patterns on bigger hooks. Mm-hmm. Because if you've got a medium dumbbell on some of these bigger hooks that I use, it doesn't flip it over really as quick as what I would like, if at all.
Yeah.
And so you want enough weight to where it's going to hit the, you know, bottom within, you know, 2 seconds. But really, I mean, any eye that you put on there besides like a, you know, just like a plastic eye is going to get that down just fine. You also want to be thinking about the materials you're using. So if it's all, you know, kind of splayed out, say EP fibers or EP brush, and you don't trim, which is perfectly fine. You know that it's going to be a little more buoyant, especially on that first cast. So, you know, you definitely want to wet that fly to help it get down. But, you know, even with enough false casting and kind of hanging out, it's gonna dry out eventually.
Yeah, I've seen patterns even in the trout world that they look fantastic. But you know that by the time they get down into the fish's face, especially some of the deeper water that we fish on multiple generators, you know that by the time it gets down there, it's time to eat a sandwich because it's lunch. You know, there's just too much material. They look fantastic, and there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, but it's not always that effective. So you gotta, there's some kind of balance there, and I don't know what that is, but yeah, I can see where folks might put a little bit too much material, and it all of a sudden is falling, you know, super slow, which in some cases that's probably fine, but it doesn't sound like it's all that great in there either.
You know, I just like to give these fish the best chance possible. And so, you know, since they they are designed to feed below their bodies. I try to get that fly down, with whatever that means. If it's in the grass and it's, trying to punch through that grass a little bit more, then yeah, I'll add a little extra weight there. If I know I'm going to be fishing some white bottom and it's going to be a little bit deeper water, but I can still see these fish pretty well, then I'll add a little bit more weight there to try to get it down. But I mean, make no mistake, a redfish will still eat off the surface. I can hear them all over the marsh eating off the surface. But I think our redfish in the Lowcountry, for whatever reason, are not as skilled in taking something off the surface as, say, you see down in Louisiana. And it's not just the big fish that I'm talking about. I'm talking about, compared size wise, usually our fish, take a few swipes at it before they'll get something like a Hell's Bay hopper. It's a great pattern, but for our redfish, I'm trying to increase my odds, as much as I possibly can.
Definitely. Yeah, I can see that for sure. Wow, that's a ton of good information right there. I mean, golly, good job, dude. That was really
Awesome.
good. Really good. We say we close this thing out.
Okay, excellent. That sounds good to me.
All right, everybody out there, feel free to share this podcast with your friends and your fishing partners. Subscribe or follow so you'll be the first to know when an episode drops. If you find value in this podcast and want to give back, drop by the Southeastern Fly store and simply just make a purchase. So Tony fishes the waters in and around Beaufort, South Carolina. As I said, he and I served on the Fly Fishing International Virtual Expo panel. He books trips out of Bay Street Outfitters in historic Beaufort, South Carolina. Tony, really appreciate you stopping by. Thank you again.
David, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You just listened to Captain Tony Welch on Southeastern Fly. See you next time.